Let's talk about applying the bond market model to a simple practical example. So here is the copy from a Wall Street Journal article about the US bond market. And we're going to use demand and supply to explain what the story says. And we'll begin by noting two key elements in the story. One key element is the first part of the story describes a change in European bond yields. European bond yields are going up. If we think European bonds are substitute assets for US Treasury bonds, an improvement in the yield on European bonds makes US Treasury bonds a little less attractive. So that's going to be a negative effect on the demand for US Treasury bonds. Remember that. Now on the supply side, the US Treasury is issuing new Treasury bonds. So we have a supply side effect that is going to move the supply curve to the right. So go to the next slide. We're going to use the standard demand and supply model to analyze the story from the Wall Street Journal. So we read that the Europeans are issuing bonds which are more attractive in their yield compared to US Treasury bonds, and so that means demand for US Treasury bonds, everything else equal, will fall, and we show that on the diagram by drawing a new demand curve that is on the left of the original demand curve. We also read that the US Treasury is issuing new bonds. So that's like an increase in the supply of bonds, and we show that on the diagram by making the supply curve move to the right. Let's make the supply curve move to the right by a lot, and you'll be able to see there is now a new equilibrium point according to standard demand and supply. And at that new equilibrium point, there is now a new equilibrium price, P2. There is a new equilibrium quantity traded, Q2, just like in traditional demand and supply. To repeat, what the story in the previous slide told us is there was an increase in supply of US bonds and a decrease in demand for US bonds. The decrease in demand for US bonds occurred because a competing asset, the European bonds, had become more attractive to buyers by offering them a better yield than previously. So demand curve moves left, supply curve moves right. We know what that means is that we're going to get a new P2 and a new Q2. Now, strictly speaking, we know for sure that the new equilibrium P will be lower. So P2 will definitely be below P1 in the new equilibrium. However, if you play around with the demand and supply curves, the location of Q2 actually could be greater than Q1, it could be the same as Q1, or it could be less than Q1. It depends on the relative movement to the left of demand and the relative movement to the right of supply. If I had moved the demand curve very far to the left and the supply curve only a little bit to the right, Q2 would actually have ended up less than Q1. This should be familiar from principles of economics, demand and supply discussions. In this case, there is no ambiguity about what will happen to price. P2 will definitely be below P1. Okay, now you recall, if the price of bonds falls, there's an inverse correlation with the interest rate, or actually in this case we'll call it the yield. P falls, therefore yield on US bonds should go up, and in fact that's exactly what did happen as part of the story that you just read. So you notice the approach. You set up a demand and supply diagram with a demand curve and a supply curve and an initial equilibrium point with an initial equilibrium P for the bonds and initial equilibrium Q for the bonds. Then you read the story carefully and apply what it says to the demand curve and the supply curve. Then, once you have your result for P, is it going up or is it going down, you then conclude what will happen to the interest rate or the yield. Same thing on the bonds. If P falls, the yield will go up. If the new equilibrium P has increased, then the yield will go down. By the way, you notice in the story from the Wall Street Journal, they make that point. There's an inverse correlation between price and yield. Let's do one more example. So here's part of another story, and we will use it to illustrate the same demand and supply forces at work. So this story is talking about how yields went up for US bonds, and there's an explanation for why the yields went up, and the explanation has to be that bond prices fell. So really the question is, why did US Treasury bond prices fall? Well, let's use the demand and supply diagram to explain it. The next slide has the demand and supply diagram, and we'll just use that to get at the story behind the story here. So the story here is that businesses are feeling more confident about the future economy. They think the future economy is becoming less risky. Therefore, their demand for what the article calls haven debt, safety debt, has fallen. So if demand for the haven debt has fallen, that is like a leftward shift in the demand curve. So we've got this new demand curve here. And at that new demand curve intersection with supply, we have a new equilibrium, and the new equilibrium has a lower equilibrium price for US bonds. A lower equilibrium price for bonds means yields go up. So we have a new equilibrium point, P2Q2. A lower price means higher yield, and that's what the story is about. Now at this point, you may wonder, wait a minute, I thought improving economic conditions caused firms to wish to borrow more so they can invest more, and that would increase demand for bonds, not decrease. So isn't there a contradiction here? Well, the explanation is, according to this particular Wall Street Journal story, the reason firms are holding US bonds is as a haven, a protection against risk. The motivation for the bonds is risk aversion, nothing to do with financing investment. So what this means, by the way, is that you have to look carefully at the story. Just saying firms have become more confident about the future does not by itself tell you what will happen to a demand curve or a supply curve. You have to study carefully and figure out what direction are the curves supposed to be moving. Okay, so that's two applications of the bond market demand and supply equilibrium model. Once you've figured out the direction the market price of bonds will change, you get automatically the direction that yields will move. And we're going to move on to a different topic next time, and see you then.